Welcome to the ZMOC program. My name's Ken Garrison, and with me is Jon Klein. Our program tonight is going to take a little bit different form than we normally do. We normally just take a topic from Bible or prophecy or whatever and develop that. But tonight a couple of questions that I want to pose for Mr. Klein that I believe will be informative and important. So let me exhort you to stay tuned and follow our discussion. John just recently returned from leading a group of people on a tour of Israel and visited sites all over the state of Israel, and we've heard reports from some of the people that went with them, and they were very, very positive from that. We want to talk about that a little bit first, and then obviously the U.S. economy is on the forefront of everyone's mind, and so John is a financial advisor. So I want to pose a few questions that I think all of us have concerning the U.S. economy, and look for his responses to those. And I think those will be very useful to all of you. So John, let's start. I know you just recently returned from Israel. Had, I understand, a very, very good trip. I know you like to visit the communities of Judea and Samaria, what the media refers to as the so-called occupied West Bank. Why do you kind of major in these communities?
Well, first of all, it's good to be back. It's always good to be back. It's good to go. Why do I major in these communities? We went to about 17 different communities in our just under 2-week tour. And the reason is because I believe the God's activity, or the emphasis of his activity in the world today, is directed towards Israel and biblical Israel, which the communities are. All the names like Shiloh and Bethel, that's biblical Israel. And, you could tell, and we talked about this on other things, you could tell what God's doing by the opposition from the world. Every peace plan calls for Israel to give up these territories, these communities in Judea and Samaria. And, 2,600 years ago, as the Jewish people were going off into captivity, Jeremiah wrote that God would bring them back from the four corners of the earth. And he specifically says in Jeremiah 16, verse 15, that he will restore to them their own land, which God gave to their fathers. And their own land is what's happening in the communities. So we find that there are people in the communities looking at the scriptures just the same as we are. They are people of faith. We are people of faith. We have a lot in common. And in fact, they're a great encouragement to us because of their great faith. They believe they are fulfilling God's commandments by living in these places.
All right. Let me inject something at that point, John. I see interviews frequently, news, media, whatever, of the so-called settlers, the people that are living in Judea and Samaria that you visited. They're almost always portrayed as some sort of wild-eyed religious zealots, dangerous people. How do you feel? Are these that dangerous?
Well, let me
pose. Why are they considered dangerous?
Because actually they're dangerous to the world system of nullifying God. Because these are people of faith. They live a biblical lifestyle just like you. Our audience is predominantly born-again Christians living a biblical lifestyle. These people are living a biblical lifestyle. They don't steal. Now, there's always a thief here and there, but these people are just lovely people. I would love to have them as my neighbors. They are just family people, family conscious, not materialistic. Just like here at Fellowship Church, if someone hurts themselves or a woman gave birth, there are other families bringing food and contributing. They do that on a community-wide basis. We'd be fortunate to have some of these people living next door to us.
We have a work crew that are currently actually engaged in a community in the Shamran called Kedemim. We've done this for a number of years, and last year I led that group, and we stayed there a couple of weeks and worked. And gosh, at night you walk up and down not very well lighted streets, for example, and never have any fear whatsoever. People don't lock their doors, and you never even had a concern. So that's kind of part of this picture. The media. So you said something. I want to work on.
Let me say something here. I'm from the big city. And we locked our doors. You're from the rural area, the hills of Kentucky.
We never.
And you didn't lock your doors.
We never
I'm telling you,
doors.
that's the kind of people that live there.
Yeah.
Old-fashioned, God-fearing, hard-working, lovely people.
Let me develop something that you hit on just a moment, and I think it's important for us to consider. As Bible-believing, Spirit-filled Christians in Orlando, for example, we are, even though you may live a perfectly wonderful faith life, you're not seen as a threat from a prophetic standpoint. Why are these people living a similar biblical lifestyle in places like Shiloh or Jerusalem or Hebron? Why are they a threat?
Well, because frankly, they're declaring that God gave them this land. They're declaring that the scriptures are true, and they're living, they're there. Listen, I have a beautiful house in Sanford, and if someone tried to take it away, we might fight about it. But if I lost the house, I don't see it as a commandment from God that I live there. It's just a place I'm going to live. These people feel they're obeying God's commandments by resettling this liberated land in Judea and Samaria. And frankly, the world is frightened of that kind of real biblical faith.
So Messiah Jesus said in his famous prayer, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." So what these people are doing are instrumental in fulfilling Jesus' prayer, I believe.
Absolutely.
All right, now I want to change the direction just a bit there. Obviously, Israel has just recently had elections, and they're in the process of trying to form a government. There seems to be a trend, at least, toward a much more conservative government. In America, the recent elections went just the opposite direction, and we have a very liberal, I suppose, government. How do you think the Israelis look at the policies of the Obama administration at this point?
I think a lot of Israelis are dismayed and think that there'll be somewhat of a shift away from, of understanding Israel's predicament, being a Western-style nation in the middle of Islamic fiefdom. On the other hand, they are convinced, at least the people that we saw most in Judea and Samaria, people of faith, they're convinced that Mr. Obama or Mr. Netanyahu, for that matter, or any world leader will only maybe delay the establishment of the kingdom of God, of redemption, or make it more painful for them, but they can't stop God. So although they look at some policies or are somewhat concerned about a turning away from supporting Israel into some dimension, and that remains to be seen, they are convinced that nothing can separate them from the love of God, frankly, and they're pulling on. They say things like, it doesn't matter what they do, it matters what we do.
All right, so
it
may sound strange to Christian ears, and I know, some 30 years ago, it was foreign to my thought pattern that these people, Jewish people on the mountains of Judea and Samaria, could be living such obviously faith life. But they are. Many of them are, Jesus talked about the crucified life. Paul developed that same message. And of course that has become a part of real Christian lifestyle. These folks, it seems to me, are personifications of the crucified life. It seems just opposite what you would anticipate. That's true.
They're not saying, what could I get out of this government, or what could this government do for me, or whatever. They're looking to obey God's commandments, bring back Jewish life on the hills of Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland, East Jerusalem, reclaim it. They believe it's not occupied territory, it's liberated territory.
Amen.
And
one Israeli friend years ago told me one time that, Ken, he said, this Jesus was almost an ideal Israeli. And so I couldn't agree with him more. John, I want to change the direction just a bit now. We've talked about the trip. We encourage everybody to go to Israel. Be sure you go with someone like Mr. Klein or myself, who's going to take you and see these types of things, because it's very, very important for you to go and to have that a part of your faith experience. Our country, our nation now is in the midst of a economic crisis. I think everybody seems to think that that's the case. John is a financial consultant and much more acquainted with the issues in this area than most of us, certainly me. And so I wanted to pose a few questions along these lines and get John's response. I hope that will be fruitful for you as you're, along with everyone else, trying to figure out what's going on around us. So the first thing I have to ask John is just how sound do you think that the U.S. economy is today?
Well, frankly, I don't think it's that sound. I don't think obviously we're in somewhat of a recession, depression here. Things are down, but and so I look at the policies to get us out of it, and I don't think the policy, it seems to me like there's almost amateurs there with book knowledge without practical experience. Well, we'll try this, and we'll try this, and we'll try the next thing. And just like, we'll label a hit on something that works here. So it's hard to have confidence in an economic system or a government that's seems to be shooting in the dark.
A few weeks ago, Jim Cramer, CNBC, I think, financial advisor, also thought that the administration was waging war against capital, or I believe that was something like his term. So you feel that there may be some merit to that?
Well, yeah, I think, frankly, there's... President Obama's stated policy was wealth redistribution.
Okay.
So maybe they don't know what they're doing. I could be wrong. They may know exactly what they're doing.
I hear a lot of people speculating that they don't. I think the latter comment is right. I think they know very well what they're doing. All right. So now I want to broaden this question a bit. A week or so ago, the Chinese, of all the people that would be commenting on this, the Chinese questioned their investment. Evidently, there is a tremendous amount of Chinese investment. I guess that would be governmental investment in U.S. Treasury bonds, actually funding our debt, our national debt. Now, the Chinese raised an issue about that, shook the trees a little bit with the idea that maybe they would withdraw their capital or call in their loans or whatever. Why are the Chinese becoming apprehensive at this point?
Well, let's look at what a treasury bond is. If I own a company and I want to sell off part of the company, and so you buy stock in the company. If I want to just borrow money, then you buy bonds, which is lending me capital to run my business, and I pay you back at an interest rate. So treasury bonds are really the Chinese with excess cash are buying bonds, and therefore they'll get interest over the next 20, 30 years. Our policy now is we are just printing dollars, Ken, instead of balancing the budget and tightening our belts and doing away with excess spending. We are printing dollars, which means that there'll be inflation. And the Chinese investment of getting, say, between 3 and 4% interest on their bonds, if they invest $1 trillion, their money is going to be eaten up in inflation, and it's not such a good investment. Could you imagine a communist country lecturing a capitalistic America on fiscal responsibility? It's if it wasn't so sad, it'd be laughable.
Okay, that leads us to a second question. Last week, also, the Federal Reserve, I believe, announced that they were printing an extra $1 trillion to buy Treasury bonds to shore up we're buying our own debt. It appears to me. Now, obviously, the Chinese are concerned about that. What would be the long-term effect of us printing more money to buy our own debt?
Okay, in a couple of years, it starts catching up, and we'll have a hyperinflation of some type because we're printing money based on nothing. Imagine if it'd be like you just have a charge card with a $100,000 balance, and you're a little short, so you just keep charging and you charge and you charge. Sooner or later, you got to pay the piper. Well, the government has two effects. Number one, our children and grandchildren will have to pay that off. It's got to be paid. But number two is that it will cause inflation. So it'll cut down the amount. Now they're banking. It'll cut down the value of the dollar. And so what they're banking on is the economy taking off, and then we'll be able to pay everything.
When you say they, you're talking about the
current administration and the Treasury Department.
Right.
And so everybody's for it based on rosy pictures of gross national product increasing greatly, 4% growth a year, and then everything will be okay. So it's a house of cards built upon optimistic projections, but only on projections. Listen, we got in trouble in the first place because we deviated from sound economic policy with social experiments. Mortgages to people that really didn't earn enough money to pay for those mortgages. And that escalated into, just phony derivatives and things. And so everybody's guilty, contributed by every administration since Jimmy Carter. But it's not sound economic policy. And if we don't get back to sound economic policy, this thing could be prolonged for 20 years or so.
Okay, in a simple response, then the effect of the Fed printing more and more money and monetizing the treasuries, the notes, is just inflation. There's no way to get around the possibility.
The dollar will be worth less. We'll buy less.
So really, that amounts to a tax. If I've got savings in any form or fashion, it means that my savings is being depleted through inflation.
That's right, because especially now when interest rates are low, you're not going to be able to keep track of it, keep up with the rate of inflation.
Right. Okay. Now that leads us to another proposal, or another question that has arisen. I've seen 2 or 3 articles in the last few days. In that there is a demand or proposal, I should say, by the Chinese to change the international medium of exchange from dollars to some global currency. I know that the OPEC nations has for a number of years threatened to change the medium of exchange to the euro as opposed to the dollar. So the question then, John, is if the world, the economy in general, were to convert to some global currency away from the U.S. dollar, what effect would that have on us?
Let's take a look at what happened with the euro. If we look at England didn't go from the pound sterling to the euro because they thought that their economy was doing much better than other European countries, and they would be dragged down by doing such a thing. And they didn't enter into that agreement. They don't use the euro, and in fact, the euro may go by the way of the dodo bird. So I think if we look at the American psyche, we are taught, and we're in our 60s here, and so we were taught that America produces the best of everything. We're number one in the world. We are the lone superpower, the economic power. I think it would be devastating for the American psyche to admit that we, for our own safety of the dollar, we have to, or of our currency, we have to be linked to third world nations to stabilize our economy. Number two, the American people are entrepreneurs. There's a great spirit of accomplishment, unless we just crush it with this kind of administration, socialistic policies. So we believe that we'll be able to recover and move right along and pay back the debt and stay a world leader. If we change to some sort of world euro system or something like that, we'll be linked as a productive nation to unproductive nations, and I think it'll be devastating in the long run. Other countries in the world don't have the capacity to the entrepreneurial spirit, the capacity to produce and become fruitful. America has that capacity, and we don't. It's not a good idea for Americans to be linked to something else. I think the Muslims nations and the Chinese, who have large investment in this country, are worried about their short-term gain or even weakening, for their own profit. At the same time, looking to weaken the United States.
Okay, let me pose this in maybe a little more simplistic manner. Let's assume that we talked about the inflationary practices that are ongoing now. Let's assume that that continues, and the administration seems to be pushing to do just that. Let's say that we did have a exchange from the dollar to a global currency. How much would you expect then perhaps to pay for a gallon of gasoline or a pair of shoes produced in China? Would you get a better deal on gasoline or shoes, or a worse deal?
Well, I think Americans with trade overseas would be paying markedly more than we're paying now.
So $200 for a pair of shoes and $100 for a fill-up. Or I mean, just obviously those numbers are jerked out of the air.
But everything we buy or import or any interaction with other countries, we would be subsidizing them.
Right.
By the dollar has always been the standard, and it goes up and down, and we don't need to change.
Okay, but it's not going to be our decision, I suspect. We're talking about.
Well, we ought to be against it then. It will eventually affect every American.
Okay.
Even though we don't think it will, if we change our system, it will affect every American. Just like printing money without having anything to back it up. I think the term we talked about was funny money. It's not. It hasn't the value that a traditional dollar has when you print more, and so everyone will wind up paying, whether it's in inflation or not being able to buy as much with the same dollar, and that will happen the other way too, and every single American will be affected.
Okay, so if a spirit-filled believer came to you and said, John, I have $10,000 or $100,000, whatever, I want to know what to do with it. What kind of approach would you take with?
Okay, if you're in a regular savings plan at work and you asked about new money, let me just address this for a minute. Just keep on what you're doing. Invest on a weekly and monthly basis, and I believe we'll come out of this if you given enough time.
You believe saving money is still a good biblical concept?
It's always a good biblical concept. Now, for short term, I would probably recommend going into treasury notes or money market or CDs or something, because the stock market is still too volatile. Unless you could plant the money for 10 to 15 years, I would be in short-term investments right now, meaning fixed investments, and be ready to, but I would not remove my 401k and take it out of the market. So I'd leave what's going, but new money.
You're talking about putting it in something that has governmental backing or guarantees on.
Yeah, because things are too unsure now.
Yeah.
Unless someone knew they were going to leave it there and had the confidence that 15, 20 years down the line they might need it. Otherwise, now's not. It's too volatile. Yesterday was a good day. Today, and we don't know what it'll be. By the time this airs tonight, we'll know what the Dow did. But you can't time the market and live daily. You have to be prudent here.
I noticed a piece in the Sentinel just recently that listed some. Obviously, they were looking at what we consider today difficult financial times and things that you could do to save and to get by. And there were 7 or 8 different practices that were listed there. And you know what? Everything that they suggested doing defined my lifestyle in good times.
Yeah.
Because I save money all the time.
We should all live just below our means, so we could be givers, not takers.
Yes, exactly, and that's a biblical
lifestyle.
God didn't intend you to be a borrower; He intended you to be a lender, and that requires
and a giver.
Yeah, and that's not just some divine heavenly blessing that comes floating out of the sky. That reflects your biblical lifestyle. And so a Torah or biblical lifestyle brings that type of blessing. God's not a magician in the sky that passes out CDs to people He loves. He blesses a given lifestyle.
There's no substitute for firm, sound financial practices, and the scriptures speak of just that. The tortoise effect.
Yep, I always believe that the tortoise wins. That's our program for tonight. It's a little bit different from our typical format. I pray that it was a blessing to you. Come and join us for our Passover Seder on April the 7th. Call in for reservations. Thank you.